Welcome back. This is the presentation on manifest destiny and westward expansion, a very important part in this mid 19th century period as we're getting closer and closer to the Civil War. Now, this isn't going to have anything directly to do with the Civil War, but you'll notice from the subtitle here, Prelude to the Union's Destruction, that it must have something to do with the Civil War because something about the spread of the United States westward is going to cause division north and south. So keep your eyes and ears open for that. But this is a presentation mainly about the concept of manifest destiny and the spread of the United States rapidly across the continent. Now, you've probably heard of this term, manifest destiny. And if you just break down the two words, its meaning becomes quite obvious. Something that is manifest is something that is obvious. It is a given. It is clear. It is obvious to all. And destiny, of course, is where a person or a country is going. It is your fate. It is something that is bound to happen. So the phrase manifest destiny implied that the United States has an obvious fate out there. It has an obvious destiny that is being made clear by a higher power. Isn't it obvious that God wants the United States to spread across the continent? Now, that phrase was popularized by a Democratic newspaper writer named James O'Sullivan in the late 1830s. And he kept on writing using that phrase in the early 1840s as well. But he doesn't really invent the concept. He put a nice phrase to it that everyone could understand. But the idea that God was blessing this nation and making it obvious that they should spread across the continent, that was an older concept. A lot of people had already attached themselves to that concept. Now, here in the 21st century, we may look back at the 19th and think, that sounds really, really arrogant. How would they assume that God Almighty has chosen this nation for this special mission, this special purpose to spread across the continent? Sounds very arrogant now. But for people in the 19th century, you have to put yourself in their position to see what remarkable things had already happened to make them have this idea that God was favoring them and wanted them to spread. That this first slide just gives you a whole bunch of possible explanations. I won't go through each one of them individually, but you get an idea here of where the whole idea of manifest destiny might have come from. This young country had been through quite a few trials from its colonial period, from the Revolutionary War, a second war with Great Britain, and it seemed that things kept working out in their favor. Now, in the 21st century, we may just attribute that to luck or to science. Um, in the 19th century, they often attribute it to God. God's power is obviously blessing this nation because look at all of the good fortune that the United States has had. There have been times when more land just almost falls in their lap without exactly a design to take it. Louisiana is the perfect example, of course. Even Florida had come into the United States after this um, Andrew Jackson campaign into Spanish territory. And then when we think about the Second Great Awakening that we've talked about recently, here's this large religious revival movement and religious reform movement where there's a great deal of confidence that this generation is going to spread the gospel everywhere within their generation, within their lifetime. And they believe that they were hastening the time that Christ's millennium would come. They were already, they believed, building Christ's kingdom right here on earth. So, for people in the early 19th century, it was not so unusual. It did not seem so far fetched to say they believe it is obvious God wants their culture to spread. Now, what specifically about American culture were they so proud of and thought God wanted to see spread? Well, two things really. One is representative government. They're very proud of American government, and there really weren't a lot of governments like this around the world. A government where the people vote, choose representatives, and then they create the government. It's not a monarchy. It's not an authoritarian government. People are quite free. So that's one thing they were very proud of. The other was religious freedom. That too was pretty rare to have a country as religious as the United States was, really dominated by Protestant Christianity, but not made Christian by law. It was a country where you're free to worship however you choose, but the culture is definitely dominated by Protestant Christianity. Those are two things, representative government and religious freedom, things that Americans were very proud of and thought, yes, God would want those things to spread. Well, we're going to look at a couple of places where manifest destiny is really worked out, where the United States spreads westward. And um, one of these areas will be Texas. So those of you from Texas, this will be a treat. This is going to be kind of review of your seventh grade Texas history course. At least that's when it was offered when I was growing up. And for others, if you don't want to hear Texans brag, well, then just sit back and try to hear what this manifest destiny is all about and why Texans will feel like they are replaying, they are reenacting what had already happened on the national level in their fight for independence. And of course, we'll see this played out in other places besides just Texas, but that will be our focus for a little while. Now, this um, this artwork does illustrate manifest destiny here. You know, we have this lady representing American civilization marching westward. Really, she seems more like she's floating. But along with her, you have stage coaches and covered wagons, even trains heading westward, inch by inch. And, you know, she is stringing behind her telegraph wires, and you can see farmers heading further west. And out in the distance, we have other symbols of wilderness, other symbols of savagery that are running away. You know, the buffalo, the Indians, they are kind of being swept aside, but not in any kind of genocidal way. This is the march of progress. This is civilization heading west. So, a good symbolic, uh, pictorial representation of what manifest destiny was supposed to be. Well, let's talk about Texas. How is Texas an example of this manifest destiny? Well, Texas was a part of Spanish territory. It was the northern frontiers of New Spain, and there weren't a lot of Spanish people living in this frontier. It was really more an area dominated by Comanche Indians. It really was their wilderness. But a man from Missouri, a man from U.S. territory, named Moses Austin, had this idea of moving a bunch of American families, Anglo American families, moving them into this Spanish territory and um, and getting a lot of land in the process. You know, he thought these American families would move into Texas with the permission of the Spanish government, and Spain would give them a whole bunch of land, more than they could have acquired in Missouri. And in turn, they would help civilize or settle this frontier land. That's why it's supposed to be mutually beneficial. The Americans would get a whole bunch of land, and potentially they'll have more wealth than they would have had. But New Spain would have a lot of settlers to help calm this frontier area dominated by Comanche Indians. That's what Moses Austin hoped. But his dream changes. The whole plan falls apart because he dies. And so does New Spain. Uh, Moses Austin passes on his plan to his son named Stephen Austin, Stephen F. Austin. And New Spain also undergoes revolution. There are people within New Spain that wanted to govern themselves instead of still being ruled by Spain all the way over in Europe. So now Stephen F. Austin wants to carry out his father's plan in the same way, only he's going to be dealing with the Mexican government, this new country that's been created. And that's what he does. Stephen F. Austin gets permission from Mexico to bring 300 families into Texas. And in exchange, he gets a whole bunch of land. All those settlers get land, very cheap. And they're going to form a community in Texas. Well, several other people follow up and do this same sort of thing. Stephen F. Austin continues to do it. He doesn't just bring the first, just 300 families and that's it. He'll draw up another contract and bring another group of families in. And there'll be other, what they call impresarios, these people from the United States who are bringing in families, creating settlements, making Texas a more livable kind of place. And this seems to be quite successful. Now, they are supposed to follow Mexican law. And for the most part, Stephen F. Austin's colony does. He certainly respected Mexican authority. In fact, there was another occasion where a man had moved in, and his settlement, close to Nacogdoches, Texas today, this settler named Hayden Edwards decided to declare his settlement completely independent. He declared them the Republic of Fredonia. And Stephen F. Austin thought, no, this is a violation of the contract. This is breaking Mexican law. You're going to make all of us look really bad. So Stephen F. Austin actually went to help suppress this so-called Fredonian rebellion. Stephen F. Austin wanted to follow Mexican law for the most part. Now, there were some things about Mexican law that Anglo-Americans felt like they could not and would not follow. First of all, Mexico didn't break away from the Catholic Church the way that the United States had complete religious freedom. Mexico still had ties with the Catholic Church, and part of the law said as these settlers come into Mexican territory, that is Texas, as they come in, they are supposed to be Catholics. Well, to get a bunch of cheap or free land, settlers will say, sure, we're Catholic, but the vast majority of them are not going to be Catholic. That's not most American settlers. And furthermore, Americans feel like no government can tell you what your religion must be. So they felt this is a Mexican law that deserves to be violated because government can't tell you what your religion is. They believe in religious freedom. That's a concept that should be spread. Another rule violation is going to have to do with slavery. Now, when Mexico became a country, they outlawed slavery because they've had this long history of slavery, not of African slaves, but enslaving Native Americans. That's what the Spanish had done through many years of conquest and the whole colonial period. But the Mexican population, most of them are made up of a mixture of Spanish and Native American blood. So they feel very strongly there should be no more slavery. But most of the people moving into Stephen F. Austin's colony and others like it, they come from Missouri or Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi. They come mainly from other southern slave states. And they feel very strongly government cannot take your property from you. They cannot insist that you have no slaves. So they bring slaves with them and then just say that they are domestic help. They are servants. They will not be completely honest about the status of these slaves that they bring with them. So there is going to be some religious cultural conflict in the early days. Americans are not going to be following Mexican law exactly, especially on those 2 points: religious freedom and your property rights, right to bring slaves into Texas. But trouble really starts brewing in the early 1830s when a new leader emerges in Mexico. Um, People in Mexico are getting concerned that there's more Anglo Americans in Texas than there are Hispanics. It makes it a very, very different part of Mexico. In fact, Texas was not its own state. It was always attached to another Mexican territory called Coahuila, Texas y Coahuila. That was the state that they were in. But um, if they had separated the two, if Texas was separate from Coahuila, then you would have one state in Mexico with a vast majority of Anglo American settlers. It would make it practically already independent or absorbed into the United States. And Mexico doesn't want to see that. So there had been um, some concern about the growing number of Americans coming in to Texas. They had an immigration problem they were trying to solve. And so they even really discouraged any new settlements. Now, that was troubling to a lot of the Anglo Americans in Texas because they felt like they've done a good thing for Mexico. There was hardly any Mexican citizen living up there before. And now there are some towns, there's farms, there's productivity. It's not just a Comanche wilderness anymore. So a lot of Texans, these Anglo Americans, felt very offended that there would be anything to stop more settlers coming in. So there's some trouble brewing. But the big trouble is going to be in 1835 and 6 when a man named Santa Anna becomes the leader of Mexico. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was a military man. He's in the Mexican army. And for a while, he had supported a decentralized kind of Mexican government. Um, Now, in Mexico, they had, this is the beginning of a new country for them. And so they go through many of the same growing pains the United States had gone through a little earlier. There are some people that wanted a more centralized government, the centralistas, and some people who wanted a more decentralized government where states had more power. Now, in Mexico, they called that the federalistas. When we hear federalist era, we think the federalists wanted a stronger centralized government. But remember, federalism is just a government where power is shared at the local level and at the central level. So you can have a federal government that leaves more power at the state level. Well, Texans loved a federal kind of government. The more power that can be left to the local and state government, the more Texas can just stand out as being very peculiar, having a very different kind of population. So Texans were, in fact, proud of the first Constitution of Mexico from 1824. because it was a very federalist constitution. It left more power in the hands of the various states. So Texas y Coahuila has a lot of its own power. They're not always just taking orders from Mexico City. But Santa Anna has been fighting rebellions in other places, and he changes his mind about what kind of government Mexico should have. He moves from being a federalista to a centralista, and he's a centralist now. And Santa Anna even takes over the government. He will just make himself president, and he will do away with the Constitution of 1824. Here's where a lot of Texans are going to feel like they are replaying what has already happened in American history. Here's a tyrant who has become president not by legitimate vote, not just through the normal channels of representative government. He's become the leader through military might, and in the process, he has made himself above the law. He has destroyed the earlier Constitution. So, a lot of Texans, these Americans living in Mexican territory, will say, we know from Thomas Jefferson, you have a right to fight against this kind of tyranny. You can declare independence. Well, in 1835 and 6, war is actually going to break out between Texans and Santa Anna's government. And this is not strictly a race war. There were Hispanics in Texas that also joined the side of this revolution. They didn't like the heavy-handed rule of Santa Anna. But there's also a lot of Anglo-Americans that have come in that never got any permission to move in. They've just come because they knew at some point this territory is likely going to be part of the United States. Look at who lives there. It's a lot of Anglo-Americans. So trouble erupts first in the town of Gonzales. Well, I shouldn't say the first trouble, but it's the first official battle of this revolution. And it very much is a replay of Lexington and Concord. The Mexican authorities show up to try to confiscate a cannon that the town of Gonzales had. But Gonzales is not about to let that cannon go. They're going to make a flag that just has a little outline of a cannon, and they say, come and take it. Come and try to take this cannon, and you're going to eat lead. They don't really have cannonballs. They'll just put, forks and scrap metal, spoons, knives, put all kinds of things in there. You can just fire it off like it's a shotgun. And the Mexican army is not going to want to approach and possibly be shredded by this cannon. So it's a very small engagement, really, but this becomes symbolic of the start of this revolution. And it's very much like British soldiers coming to confiscate the guns in Lexington and Concord. We have the start of a Texas revolution. Well, the most famous battle, of course, is the Battle of the Alamo. What happens here was Texans had taken over the town of San Antonio, really about the only town of any significant size. The Texans had taken it over and chased a Mexican army out. They felt as if we've won. But this is only the beginning. When Santa Anna hears about this, he's personally going to lead a really large army, 5,000 strong, into Texas to suppress this rebellion. So the Mexican army has come back, and so a group of Texans, which is going to be some Anglo, some Hispanic, some volunteers from other states, newcomers, they're going to be gathered at this old Spanish mission called the Alamo, and it hasn't really been used as a mission in a long time. It's been an um, army supply place. It's been a storage for military goods. these Texans are going to stay at the Alamo to try to defend and not let Santa Anna take San Antonio back over. Well, there's several important individuals, legendary figures who converge on the Alamo. Um, there's Davy Crockett from Tennessee. Davy Crockett had been a, a politician, a Whig congressman. He's very well known. He's already a legend in his own lifetime, not just as politician, but as outdoorsman and storyteller. Books have already been written about the exploits of Davy Crockett, a famous outdoorsman. A lot of it's tall tale, some shreds of truth there, but Davy Crockett is a man who is a Whig politician, but he exemplifies that the Whigs have figured out how to appeal to the common man. You have a character like Davy Crockett, dressed in buckskin, telling tall tales, some bragging and exaggeration, um, and you win over a lot of common people. So he's from Tennessee, but he's not really a Jacksonian Democrat. He's the other side of politics, a Whig. But Davy Crockett had recently lost a local election. He was not going to be a congressman from Tennessee. So he was upset and he decided he was leaving Tennessee. He just happens to come into Texas right at the time that trouble is brewing. So, not so good for him if he wanted to live a long life, but good news for him if he wants to go down in a blaze of glory and make himself even more legendary. Davy Crockett's at the Alamo. There's also a man named Jim Bowie, another legend, perhaps a lesser legend than Davy Crockett. Jim Bowie had had a pretty unsavory life up to this point. Um, he was involved in lots of fraudulent land deals where he would try to claim um, that he was the owner of land, try to make fake deeds and make money this way. But he eventually, and he had been quite a fighting frontiersman too. The Bowie knife was named for Jim Bowie, and it's just an extra big, thick, and longer knife, and it gives you an advantage if you're in a knife fight. Jim Bowie was in a lot of knife fights, and so there were stories about his Bowie knife. By the way, when I was in seventh grade, um, and we had Texas history projects, I think almost every boy in seventh grade made a Bowie knife. Now, it's not that we shaped metal ourselves, but there was a little kit that you could buy, and you put the handle on together, and you sharpen it, and you stain the wood and everything. Every boy turns in this, and probably some girls too, turned in a Bowie knife. And when I tell people that now, they're shocked. Imagining the whole seventh grade coming to school with a 12-inch blade. Well, it's not because it was just a more innocent time, um, and no one would ever think of hurting someone with a knife. There were fights almost daily at school. It was quite a bit more frequent, I think, than it is now in our zero tolerance atmosphere for fighting at school. But no one thought about using their history project to hurt someone else. They had their own knives for that. So interesting step back into my childhood. But Jim Bowie was also present at the Alamo. He would have been in command, but he was ill. And so another man named William Barrett Travis was really in command at the Alamo. Travis has an interesting background too. Not quite the frontier legends of the other two, but he had been an Alabama lawyer who left his family in Alabama to seek a whole new life, a new fortune in Texas. He did not have any permission to come into Texas. And by the way, Jim Bowie did marry into a very prominent Spanish family. Um, Bowie um, married a wealthy girl from a wealthy family, um, but She had died, and the in-laws had died because of a recent um, disease outbreak. I can't remember if it's cholera or what, but he had really lost all of his loved ones just prior to this Alamo. He doesn't really have a lot to lose. But William Barrett Travis had already left his family to just come to Texas, and he was really a troublemaker for Mexico from the beginning. He never pretended to follow Mexican law. He knew this is going to be U.S. territory soon. Well, these are three of the 185 or so defenders of the Alamo. And Santa Anna comes with his army and surrounds the place and lets them know if they don't surrender now, he will show no mercy. They'll all be killed. But William Barrett Travis answers back that, we're not surrendering, we're not giving up. He just fires a cannon back at Santa Anna's men, and then he writes this letter to be sent out by a writer who can escape through the lines to appeal to Americans anywhere. Travis is going to say, look, we are determined to defend ourselves here in the name of liberty, in the name of good representative government, standing up against this military tyrant who's destroyed a constitution. But we're appealing to Americans to come to our aid. If they don't, we'll still fight to the death, but we're hoping some Americans will come rescue us. Well, the Alamo is going to be a 13-day standoff where the Mexican army makes some attempts toward the wall, but they're basically just firing cannons at it, and the defenders are firing back. But after just less than 2 weeks, Santa Anna will just order a charge, and there'll be too many people that can just overwhelm the defenders, and they will reach the walls. It's going to cost Santa Anna 1,500 men to take the whole Alamo, but he does take it, and they do kill all of the men who defended the Alamo. There were some families inside, and they let one woman and child escape to spread the word. This is what's going to happen if you oppose Santa Anna. Well, meanwhile, while this Battle of the Alamo was taking place, another group of Texans were forming a new government. Texans declared their independence in a separate meeting while this battle was taking place. They called that meeting place, there's not really much of a town there, but they called it Washington on the Brazos River. Washington. They're recalling this is like the beginning of the United States. We've declared independence. We're calling this place Washington, the founding father of the United States. And the most significant newcomer there, relative newcomer, was another Tennessee man named Sam Houston. Now, Sam Houston had also been a politician in Tennessee. In fact, he had been the governor of Tennessee. He was a friend and loyal supporter, fellow fighter along with Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. And Sam Houston had gone on to become the governor of the state of Tennessee. But he leaves Tennessee because he has some embarrassment there. He was married to a girl much younger than he was, but almost as soon as they were married, just after the honeymoon, she wants an annulment. Now that has people really whispering rumors. What could have happened on a honeymoon that would make a young wife now decide she doesn't want to be married? That's embarrassing. So Sam Houston leaves Tennessee, leaves the governorship, and comes to Texas, also with the idea this is going to be U.S. territory someday. And he comes while Andrew Jackson was still president. Well, Sam Houston's going to be nominated the leader of their army, the Texas Army. So he's not at the Alamo, fortunately for him, because he will still be alive. But he will be gathering an army to oppose Santa Anna. And of course, everyone's heard about, the exploits of Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812. Why can't Sam Houston um, fight that well also? It seems like he did nothing but run away from Santa Anna's army. But in April 1836, he finally surprises Santa Anna as he's almost run out of the state. He's almost gotten to Louisiana. He decides to turn and face uh, Santa Anna's army. And uh, and by the way, remembering other details, before Santa Anna starts pursuing Sam Houston's army, he actually catches another uh, Texas army that was supposed to come and reinforce the Alamo, but they stay outside, and they're captured at a town called Goliad. Now there's 350 Texans here who have heard what happened at the Alamo, and they thought, well, if you just keep fighting, obviously Santa Anna kills everyone. So when they had lost the battle, they decided to surrender, thinking they'll be exchanged or ransomed somehow. Instead, at Goliad, Santa Anna has these men disarmed and lined up and shot. There are a few that will manage to escape as they realize we're just being gunned down as we're unarmed. Um, but Goliad's a much bigger massacre than the Alamo had been. The Alamo, 180 something Texans are killed. At Goliad, there's almost 350 killed. So this is all before Sam Houston is going to surprise Santa Anna and turn to face him at this decisive Battle of San Jacinto. That's the more, I think, correct Spanish pronunciation, the best I can do, San Jacinto. But growing up in West Texas and saying it more Anglo American style, it's the Battle of San Jacinto. This is the decisive battle because Sam Houston catches Santa Anna's men completely by surprise. He cuts off all their ways of escape, and um, his army comes through Santa Anna's camp while many of them are napping. And in less than 20 minutes, they've they've killed many of Santa Anna's men. They've captured the army. They've captured Santa Anna. Now that's really most important. If you have El Presidente as a captive, and for a while they don't even realize they have him. He's trying to disguise himself as a common soldier. Um, you know, they can't really look on the internet and see what does this guy really look like. They don't have photographs of him, but they can see other men saluting him even while uh, he's trying to disguise himself as a common soldier. His underwear are fancier, and people will know that's not a common soldier. He must be an officer. He's more than just an officer. He's the president. Well, having having Santa Anna, a lot of men thought of nothing more than torturing him. They've said, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. This guy is a tyrant. He's ruthless. He should be tortured and killed now. But Sam Houston, while he was injured in this battle, says, no, we can use him to much greater effect than just having fun torturing him. In fact, we can make him sign that Texas is independent. Now, he won't mean it, but they will get um, they will get Santa Anna to sign Texas is independent from Mexico. So the Battle of San Jacinto or San Jacinto is really this decisive battle. It's not that the Texans had won much before this, but they've won this battle in much the same fashion that Andrew Jackson defended New Orleans in very rapid fashion. Sam Houston has overwhelmed this larger Mexican army, and now they've gotten the Mexican president to declare Texas is independent. Now, um, what does this mean then? Texas is going to go on as an independent republic for about a decade before they're going to be annexed into the United States. Part of it's because there's a lot of argument, there's a lot of debate about whether or not Texas should be admitted to the U.S. I mean, there are a lot of people who want to see that. Andrew Jackson, of course, hopes for that, but he was leaving office just about the time Texas wins their independence, 1836. Here are the basic um, points of debate over Texas. For Americans who did not want to see Texas added to the United States, it was because they're afraid this will just be one more gigantic slave state. It may be broken up into 5 slave states just to give themselves more senators. This will be something that will help slavery spread further west. And if Texas is annexed by the United States, it's almost certainly going to mean war between the United States and Mexico. So for people who don't want to see Texas joined to the Union, joined to the United States, these are the reasons. It's because of slavery, it's because of certain war with Mexico. Mexico hasn't really accepted Texas independence. They've just reluctantly, they acknowledge that this is what Santa Anna has signed, but now he's not going to be president. He'll lose his position after that. Now, there are other Americans who wanted to see Texas joined. People from southern states who weren't afraid of slavery spreading. In fact, they want it. They would say, we must have Texas. It's our people, it's American people living there. Plus, these supporters of annexing Texas would say, if we don't add Texas to the US, then we're afraid Texas could get an alliance with Great Britain, perhaps France, some big European country. They'll have support from abroad, and Texas could continue to spread across the continent. Texas will be a rival to the United States. They'll have their own manifest destiny, and they will spread westward. So these were the basic debate points that go on for a number of years before Texas is added to the U.S. Now, that we'll get to how that happens in just a moment. The picture you see over my video here, this is a statue of Sam Houston, just as you're going into the town of Huntsville, Texas. That's where Sam Houston State University is located. I got my master's degree there as a commuter, so I drove by this giant statue all the time. And you can't really, I think I'm blocking someone, but people are very short. A person stands up about this high, and here are the tall trees of East Texas, and Sam Houston towering over them. Everything's got to be big in Texas here, and you've got to. And Sam Houston, more than anyone, has got to go big. Well, in in 1844, presidential election has a lot to do with manifest destiny. It has a lot to do with the potential for westward expansion. Now, Henry Clay was still at it. He's still the leader of the Whig Party, but he's not been their candidate in their most recent election. They won with William Henry Harrison, but then he passed away shortly after that election. So the Whigs have really still been denied having a long-term president. The vice president that became president, John Tyler, doesn't turn out to be much of a Whig after all. He had become an anti-Andrew Jackson guy, but the Whigs are still waiting for that chance to really capture the presidency. So their leader, Henry Clay, is going to be their candidate, as he had been in the past, back in 1832 and 36. Well, 1844 seems like his year to win, but he doesn't really commit himself on the question of manifest destiny. The Whig Party was not the party who was so anxious about spreading west. The Whigs were more interested in developing land we already have. We have a lot of land. Let's see this improved first before we go gobble up some more land. But most Americans were anxious to see the United States spread. It was manifest destiny. Remember, that was a Democratic newspaper man's phrase, manifest destiny. So Henry Clay tries to be a politician and say what people want to hear, but he doesn't really commit himself on manifest destiny. On the other hand, the Democratic Party, they nominate this figure who, when they went to the convention, no one expected James K. Polk to be the nominee. This is why he's a dark horse. He was not the horse everyone was betting on to become the Democratic nominee. But after many ballots, after Martin Van Buren can't get enough votes to become the nominee, more and more support shifts to Polk, a Tennessee politician. I talked about a lot of Tennessee people while we're talking Texas. There is a connection here. Polk becomes the Democratic nominee. And he makes it absolutely clear his goals are to spread westward. He says, if I'm elected president, we are going to add Texas to the Union. We are going to obtain California. We are going to obtain Oregon. And, he has some other Democratic economic issues he'll talk about. But it's mostly westward expansion, and I'm going to do it all in one term. I will not run a second time. I'll be a one-term president. Well, the people vote for James K. Polk. He wins this election. And in many ways, that seemed like a mandate, a popular support for westward expansion. Henry Clay is going to be disappointed again. Well, some of Polk's work is actually done for him. As soon as he wins this election, the sitting president, John Tyler, decides it's time to annex Texas. So he will call a joint session of the Senate and the House to meet together, and they vote to approve annexing Texas. Of course, Texas has to approve too, but they get it done before Polk even comes into office. So some of what he said he's going to do is done for him. Other parts he will accomplish in that one term in office. Now, Oregon Territory, I need to flash to a map here so in just a moment, so you'll see where I'm talking about. But Oregon Territory included more than just the state of Oregon, which would be right here. Now, Oregon was really present-day Oregon, Washington, parts of Idaho, maybe a little Montana in this, and it goes above into the Canadian part, what is now British Columbia. Oregon Territory was all of this, all the way up to the border of Alaska. Now, for many years, this had just been jointly occupied by both Americans and the British. But with Manifest Destiny, there's been a much more steady stream of Americans moving into this territory, enough to really overwhelm the number of British citizens there. But they're really just jointly occupied. Well, under James K. Polk, there's a lot of Americans who are insisting that America should take all of Oregon. In fact, there's a chant that starts 5440 or fight. Now, what they mean is 54 degrees, 40 minutes north. That's a line of latitude. That would take you all the way to Alaska. We want all of Oregon. We're going to get all the way up to 5440, 54 degrees, 40 minutes north, or we're ready to fight. We'll go round 3 with Great Britain if they insist on taking some of this land that's destined for us. Oregon Territory will be ours. Well, it did almost come to war until finally there is some negotiation, a compromise with Great Britain. And the compromise is going to look very much like um, what the dividing line had been before. Here's the border between Canada and the United States, just a line of latitude at 49 degrees. And finally, the compromise will be not all the way up to 54.40 or fight. It's just going to stay at 49 degrees. Just keep on that same line of latitude, except right here at Vancouver Island, they're not going to split it. They'll say that belongs to Great Britain. But the bigger victory for the United States was they completely have the Columbia River. Some people in Great Britain were thinking that should be the boundary, this natural river boundary. Um, but the United States is going to insist on having this river, both sides. So, little trivia question, if you're looking at a map of the United States and you're wondering what's the northernmost part, not counting Alaska, but right here in the rest of continental US, what's the northernmost point? Well, Washington and Montana, Idaho, it's all on the same line of latitude. You have to get all the way over here to Minnesota where there's a lake that juts up above that line. And that's the northernmost part of the United States outside of Alaska. Maine doesn't even get all the way up to that 49-degree line, though it looks like it does. So there's compromise to avoid war with Great Britain. But at the same time, Polk was having trouble down south of the border too. And this is where there really will be war and not compromise. Here again, I'll need to go to the map for you to see what exactly happens here. We could spend a lot of time on the Mexican-American War, but time won't allow us to do that. So here, Texas, there was a dispute over exactly where the boundary of Texas really was. Most, Stephen F. Austin, most of the settlers were over here in East Texas, where it's quite a bit more watered than it is in Western Texas. I grew up around this part. Not a lot of water, not a lot of trees, not a lot of anything. But in the dispute over where Texas' boundary was, Mexico was insisting that this river, the Nueces River, was the boundary. For Texans and the United States who just annexed Texas, they're going to say, no, it's the Rio Grande. This river here, I'm running backward, I'm running upstream. But this Rio Grande River, that's the real boundary of Texas. So all this between Rio Grande and Nueces River is disputed territory. Well, the United States, President Polk sends an army here to this boundary and even crossing into this disputed territory. Now, as far as General Zachary Taylor, he's on the American side as far as he's concerned. But as far as Mexico is concerned, they've just invaded Mexico and they're going to fight to defend Mexico. So first battles here are going to take place right here along the current Texas-Mexico border. And Zachary Taylor will go on to win battles here and in Monterrey, Buena Vista. Zachary Taylor becomes a very famous general here, successful in winning this war. My picture is kind of covering up another part of the fight where another General Winfield Scott will come in and actually invade Veracruz and capture Mexico City. The war is really interesting, but we're going to look more at its aftermath or its consequences here. There was great opposition to this war because many people saw this war as nothing more than a Democratic Party attempt to take more territory and see slavery spread. That is why John Quincy Adams is going to oppose the war. There's a transcendentalist writer named Henry David Thoreau who famously opposes the war. He goes to jail rather than pay poll taxes to vote. He says he's not going to pay any taxes that are going to support this government. That's his um, that's his protest, his civil disobedience, and that's going to be an example later for um, Martin Luther King, his protests against American law. Um, but despite a lot of opposition, there's a lot of support for the war as well. And it is a victory for the United States eventually. But the I'll skip down to this. We'll come back to Wilmot Proviso later. The result of the Mexican American War is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848. Now, what that treaty does is it gives the United States all of this land here. It includes California. It includes, they're calling all of this New Mexico, but really states of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado. Huge chunk of land called the Mexican Cession. It's land that Mexico has ceded to the United States, or they've sold because they've been defeated in this war, and they know this land can be taken, and the war will just keep going on if they don't agree to sell it. And of course, Texas was secured for the United States with the Rio Grande as the boundary. Mexico's lost a huge chunk of their land. Now, here's the link to next things that we'll look at. Having this land, this Mexican cession, it means the United States has really grown rapidly. That by 1848, they really have stretched from sea to shining sea. It's the fulfillment of manifest destiny. However, obtaining all that land is going to raise the slavery question again like it's never been raised before. What's going to happen in these new lands? Can slavery spread to California? Will slavery be in New Mexico territory? These questions are going to divide North and South even more than they ever had been before. So, in many ways, obtaining all this land from the West was going to lead to the destruction of the United States. It's going to split North and South into a civil war. We're getting closer and closer there. So stick with me and you'll see how it comes about. See you next time. Bye.